The first thing people noticed about the hospital was how quiet it was. Not the normal kind of silence you find in an abandoned building, but a heavy silence that seemed to swallow every sound. Even before entering, workers complained that the place felt wrong. The hospital had been closed since the late 1990s after years of financial problems, and for more than 2 decades it sat untouched at the edge of the city, slowly decaying behind rusted gates and overgrown trees. By early 2025, the building was finally scheduled for demolition. Before the crews could begin tearing it down, a maintenance team was sent inside to inspect the structure and remove anything considered hazardous. Most of the building looked exactly how they expected. Long hallways covered in dust, broken ceiling panels hanging from above, old wheelchairs left where they had been abandoned years earlier, medical charts scattered across the floor. Everything felt frozen in time. However, during your inspection of the 4th floor, the workers discovered something that immediately stood out. At the far end of a corridor was a single room sealed shut with a heavy chain wrapped around the door handles. A faded metal plate beside the entrance identified it as room 417. Nobody could explain why it had been locked. The hospital's remaining records mentioned nothing unusual about the room. Former employees who were contacted claimed they either could not remember it or refused to discuss it. One retired nurse reportedly became visibly uncomfortable when asked about room 417 and ended the conversation immediately. The more questions people asked, the stranger things became. Eventually, the maintenance supervisor decided the room needed to be inspected like every other part of the building. The chain was cut and the door slowly opened. What waited inside shocked everyone standing in the hallway. Unlike every other room in the hospital, room 417 looked occupied. The bed was perfectly made. A glass of water sat on the bedside table. The curtains were clean and neatly arranged. There was no dust on the furniture, no signs of decay. It looked as though someone had been living there only hours earlier, despite the fact that the hospital had been abandoned for more than 20 years. The workers immediately searched the room, expecting to find evidence that someone had been secretly staying there. They found nothing. No food, no cluing, no heathen entrances, no indication that anyone had entered recently. Yet everything remained unerringly clean. One worker opened a small drawer beside the bed and discovered an old journal. The notebook appeared worn from years of use. Curious, he opened it and began reading. The first pages seemed normal enough. They described daily life inside the hospital from the perspective of a patient whose name was never mentioned. But as the entries continued, the tone changed dramatically. The writer repeatedly described seeing a man standing inside the room at night. At first, the figure appeared near the doorway. The patient assumed he was a doctor or nurse, but according to the journal, the man never spoke, never moved. He simply stood there watching. One entry read, "The staff says nobody entered my room last night." Another said, "I know what I saw. He was standing by the door again." As the weeks passed, the entries became increasingly disturbing. Tonight he stood halfway across the room. Then, tonight he was beside the window. Then, tonight he stood at the foot of my bed. The handwriting became shakier with each entry. Some pages were filled with frantic notes written repeatedly across the paper. "He's getting closer. He's getting closer. He's getting closer." Several workers later admitted they felt uncomfortable reading the journal and wanted to leave the room immediately. The final pages were the worst. One entry read, "Tonight he stood beside the bed." Another simply said, "I pretended to sleep. He leaned over me." Then came the final completed page. It contained only a single sentence written in large, uneven letters. "Tomorrow he will be where I am." After that, every remaining page was blank. There was no explanation for what happened to the patient. No discharge record, no death certificate, no mention of the person anywhere in the hospital archives. Researchers later spent weeks investigating the mystery and made a disturbing discovery. According to official records, room 417 had supposedly remained empty during the years the journal was written. No patient had ever been assigned there. The notebook should not have existed at all. The story might have ended there if strange incidents had not begun occurring after the room was opened. Several members of the maintenance crew reported vivid nightmares involving the hospital. Every dream followed the same pattern. They would wake up inside room 417, unable to move, while a dark figure stood somewhere inside the room. Each night the figure appeared slightly closer. One worker quit after experiencing the dream for 7 consecutive nights. Another refused to return to the site after claiming he woke up with muddy footprints leading from his bedroom door to the side of his bed. The most disturbing event occurred 3 weeks after the room was opened. A worker returned alone to retrieve equipment accidentally left behind during an inspection. As he walked through the 4th floor corridor, he noticed something strange. Room 417 was open again. Everyone knew it had been locked after the journal was discovered. Assuming another employee had reopened it, he approached the room. From the hallway, he could see someone lying beneath the blanket on the bed. The shape was unmistakable. A person appeared to be sleeping there. The worker called out several times, but received no answer. The figure never moved. Gathering his courage, he stepped inside and pulled back the blanket. The bed was empty. There was nobody there, but resting on the pillow was a photograph. The image showed the maintenance crew standing outside room 417 on the day they first opened it. Everyone from the team was visible except the worker holding the photograph. Confused, he looked closer. He was in the picture after all, not standing with the group. He was sitting on the hospital bed inside room 417, staring directly at the camera. The photograph made no sense. Nobody had entered the room before the picture was taken. Terrified, he ran from the building and never returned. A few months later, demolition crews finally began tearing down the hospital. During the destruction of the 4th floor, workers discovered a small metal box hidden inside the wall behind where the bed had once stood. Inside was a folded piece of paper covered in faded handwriting. Investigators later confirmed the note was decades old. It contained only 8 words. "If the bed is empty, do not stay." The hospital was completely demolished by the end of the year. Today, nothing remains except an empty field where the building once stood. Yet among former workers, one detail continues to be discussed. Several people involved in the demolition claim they still occasionally dream about room 417. In every version of the dream, they wake up alone in a hospital bed and see a dark figure standing somewhere inside the room. And every time they have the dream, the figure is a little closer than before. The sound came from behind a wall that wasn't supposed to be hollow. It was the middle of January 2025, during one of the coldest winters the region had seen in years, when a demolition crew entered the abandoned St. Alden Hospital to prepare it for destruction. The building had stood empty since 1998. Snow piled against its broken windows every winter, and local residents avoided it after dark because of stories that had circulated for decades. Most people dismissed those stories as local legends. The workers certainly did. Their job was simple: inspect the structure, remove hazardous materials, and prepare the building for demolition. Everything was going according to plan until one worker named Daniel heard 3 loud knocks echo through a concrete wall on the 4th floor. The sound was so clear that everyone nearby stopped what they were doing. At first, they assumed it was old pipes shifting beneath the freezing temperatures. Then it happened again. 3 slow knocks, deliberate, evenly spaced, as though someone was standing on the other side, asking to be let out. The problem was that according to every floor plan available, there was nothing behind that wall except solid concrete. Curious, the workers began investigating. One of them tapped different sections of the wall with a metal tool and quickly discovered a hollow area stretching nearly 20 feet across. That made no sense. The hospital blueprints showed no rooms there, no storage areas, nothing at all. After several hours of searching through archived records stored in the hospital basement, one worker discovered an older blueprint dated 1987. Unlike the modern plans, this version showed an entire patient ward hidden behind the wall. Dozens of rooms, a nurse's station, storage closets, everything. Yet the strange ward appeared to have been completely erased from every later version of the building plans. Nobody could explain why. The discovery immediately attracted attention from supervisors, and permission was granted to investigate further. Behind several rusted filing cabinets and layers of drywall, the crew eventually uncovered a large steel door sealed shut decades earlier. There was no handle on the outside, no indication of blockade, nothing indicating it had ever existed. The door looked as though someone had gone out of their way to hide it forever. After nearly an hour of work, the workers finally forced it open. A blast of freezing air rushed out from the darkness beyond, left everyone speechless. The hidden ward looked untouched by time. Unlike the rest of the hospital, which was covered in dust and decay, this section appeared strangely preserved. Beds remained neatly arranged inside patient rooms. Medical equipment sat exactly where it had been left. Wheelchairs stood parked beside walls. Patient charts rested on desks. Even calendars still hung in some rooms displaying dates from the early 1990s. It looked less like an abandoned hospital and more like a place where people had simply vanished. As workers explored deeper, they began uncovering patient records. Hundreds of them. Most described individuals suffering from severe sleep disorders, recurring nightmares, and extreme paranoia. What disturbed everyone was that many of the reports contained nearly identical descriptions. Different patients, different years, same story. They all claimed to see a tall man standing at the far end of the hallway during the night. According to the records, the figure never spoke, never moved while being watched, never approached anyone directly. He simply stood there observing. Doctors repeatedly dismissed the reports as hallucinations caused by medication or mental illness. However, several nurses had added handwritten notes in the margins. One nurse wrote that she saw the figure herself while making rounds at 2 a.m. Another claimed the man appeared closer every night. A third requested immediate reassignment after seeing someone standing outside an empty patient room despite the ward being under lockdown. The deeper workers searched, the more unsettling the records became. Some patients described hearing footsteps outside their doors every night. Others claimed someone knocked 3 times on the walls before disappearing. One patient insisted the man was searching for a specific room. Another wrote that the figure became visible only during snowstorms. Then the crew reached the final room at the end of the ward. Unlike every other room, it was locked. The door showed signs of having been reinforced from the outside. After forcing it open, workers discovered something none of them expected. Every wall was covered in photographs. Hundreds of them. Patients, doctors, nurses, maintenance staff, visitors. Images spanning decades. At first glance, the pictures appeared ordinary. Then someone noticed the same man appearing in the background of several photographs. Once they saw him, they couldn't stop noticing him. He was in nearly every image, standing at the end of hallways, visible through windows, reflected in mirrors, watching from distant corners of rooms. And in every photograph, he looked exactly the same. Same face, same dark coat, same expressionless stare. Decades passed between some of the pictures, yet he never appeared to age. Hidden beneath a cabinet, workers discovered a leather-bound journal belonging to a nurse named Eleanor Hayes. Her entries described increasing fear among hospital staff as unexplained events began occurring throughout the ward. Patients vanished from locked rooms. Footsteps echoed through empty hallways. Security guards reported seeing someone standing motionless near the nurse's station after midnight. The final pages became frantic and difficult to read. Eleanor repeatedly wrote about a man who seemed to move closer every time she saw him. One entry stated she first noticed him at the far end of the corridor. Another said he had reached the center of the ward. The final entry contained only one sentence written repeatedly across several pages. He's almost reached the last room. Shortly after the hidden ward was opened, strange incidents began affecting the demolition crew. Workers reported hearing footsteps behind them despite being alone. Several claimed they saw a tall figure watching from distant hallways before disappearing around corners. One security guard reviewing overnight footage discovered something impossible. At exactly 3:30 a.m., cameras captured a man walking slowly through the ward. He stopped outside every patient room as if searching for someone. When he reached the final room covered in photographs, the camera feed abruptly failed. The next morning, workers entered the room and discovered a new photograph hanging among the others. It showed the demolition crew standing outside the hidden ward on the day they discovered it. Nobody remembered taking the picture. Nobody could explain where it came from. As they examined the image more closely, they realized one worker was missing from the group. Then they found him. He was standing at the far end of the corridor behind everyone else. Beside him stood the same pale man from the photographs. Both appeared to be staring directly toward the camera. The worker quit immediately after seeing the image and refused to discuss the incident again. Weeks later, demolition finally began. The hidden ward was destroyed along with the rest of the hospital. During the final stages of demolition, workers uncovered a sealed envelope hidden inside the wall of the photograph room. Inside was a single yellowed sheet of paper dated December 1992. It contained only 9 words. When he reaches the last room, lock the ward. No explanation accompanied the note. No record explained who wrote it. No documents revealed why the ward had been hidden from future blueprints. The hospital was reduced to rubble by spring. Today, nothing remains except an empty snow-covered field where the building once stood. Yet years later, former crew members still speak about one detail they cannot explain. Several of them reported recurring dreams after the demolition. In every dream, they found themselves walking through the hidden ward exactly as it appeared on the day it was discovered. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead. The patient rooms stood open and empty. At the far end of the hallway stood a tall man in a dark winter coat, motionless, watching, and every time they had the dream, he was standing a little closer than before. Nobody noticed the light at first. The abandoned hospital sat alone beyond the outskirts of town, surrounded by frozen fields and buried beneath years of local legends. Every winter, snowstorms would swallow the building almost completely, leaving only its upper floors visible through the drifting snow. Most residents avoided the area entirely. The hospital had closed in 1997 after a series of unexplained incidents, and over time the stories surrounding it became darker than the truth itself. Some claimed patients disappeared during blizzards. Others spoke about strange voices heard through the intercom system years after the electricity had been disconnected. Most people dismissed these stories as exaggerations. Then, during a severe snowstorm in February 2025, a truck driver passing through the area reported seeing lights shining from the hospital's top floor. At first, nobody believed him. The building had no power. It hadn't had power for nearly 3 decades. Yet within days, several other people reported seeing the same thing. Every night between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., lights appeared in the northern wing of the hospital before disappearing again shortly before dawn. The reports eventually caught the attention of a local photographer named Kevin Moore, who specialized in documenting abandoned places during winter. Curious, he decided to investigate. Armed with cameras, flashlights, and cold weather gear, Kevin entered the hospital shortly after midnight during another heavy snowfall. The lower floors appeared exactly as expected. Dust covered every surface. Ice formed along broken windows. Wind whistled through empty hallways. Nothing seemed unusual. Then he reached the 3rd floor. Standing at the end of a corridor, he noticed a faint yellow light glowing beneath a door. The sight immediately made him stop. There should not have been any lights anywhere in the building. As he approached, the light suddenly disappeared. The hallway became dark again. Kevin entered the room expecting to find another explorer or perhaps evidence of squatters. Instead, the room was completely empty. The only unusual detail was the temperature. While the rest of the hospital felt freezing, this room was noticeably warm. Confused but intrigued, Kevin continued exploring. Over the next hour, he repeatedly saw lights appearing ahead of him. Sometimes they shone from behind closed doors. Other times they glowed briefly at the end of distant corridors before vanishing. Each time he reached their location, he found nothing. Eventually, he climbed a staircase leading to a section of the hospital known as the snowbound wing. The area had once been used to house long-term patients during harsh winters. According to local records, the wing was permanently closed shortly before the hospital itself shut down. The reasons were never clearly explained. As Kevin entered the wing, he noticed something strange immediately. Unlike the rest of the building, there was no dust on the floor. Fresh footprints stretched down the hallway. The tracks appeared recent. They led from room to room before disappearing around a corner. Thinking someone else was inside the hospital, Kevin followed them. The footprints eventually stopped outside a patient room near the end of the wing. The door stood slightly open. Inside sat an old hospital bed facing the window. Beside it stood a lamp. The lamp was turned on. Kevin stared in disbelief. The bulb emitted a soft yellow glow despite the building having no electricity. He approached cautiously and examined the lamp. There were no batteries, no power source, nothing connected to it, yet continued glowing. Then he noticed something resting on the bed, a patient file. The folder appeared old, but remarkably well preserved. Inside were medical records dating back to the winter of 1996. Most belonged to patients admitted during a particularly severe blizzard that isolated the hospital for nearly 2 weeks. Several reports described increasing panic among patients and staff after repeated sightings of an unidentified person wandering the wing at night. According to witness statements, the individual wore a winter coat and was often seen standing outside patient rooms during snowstorms. Nurses claimed the person was not listed among staff or patients. Security searches never found anyone matching the description. The final reports became increasingly disturbing. Multiple patients disappeared over the course of 3 nights. Their rooms were found empty, beds untouched, windows locked from the inside. No explanation was ever recorded. Kevin continued reading until he reached the final page. It described an emergency evacuation of the entire wing during a blizzard. Staff reported seeing lights moving through empty hallways after all patients had supposedly been relocated. The document ended abruptly mid-sentence. At that moment, Kevin heard footsteps somewhere nearby. Slow footsteps, deliberate footsteps, moving through the corridor outside. Assuming another explorer had entered the building, he stepped into the hallway and called out. No response came. The footsteps stopped immediately. The corridor was empty. Yet at the far end of the wing, another light had appeared, this one brighter than before. It shone through an open doorway. Kevin walked toward it. The closer he got, the colder the air became. Snow drifted across the floor despite the room being deep inside the building. As he reached the doorway, he froze. Inside stood a hospital room that looked occupied. Fresh sheets covered the bed. Medical equipment sat neatly arranged beside it. A lamp glowed softly near the window, and standing beside the bed was a man wearing a dark winter coat. The figure remained completely motionless. Kevin later claimed he could not explain why, but he felt an overwhelming urge not to enter the room. Instead, he slowly backed away. As he did, the lamp flickered once, then twice, then went out completely. The room vanished into darkness. Kevin turned on his flashlight and immediately pointed it back toward the doorway. The room was empty. The bed was gone. The equipment was gone. Even the walls looked different. It appeared to be an ordinary abandoned hospital room once again. Terrified, Kevin left the building and returned home before dawn. When reviewing his photographs later that morning, he discovered something disturbing. Several images taken inside the snowbound wing showed lights glowing at the ends of hallways. In others, a man in a winter coat appeared standing in distant doorways. But the final photograph was the most unsettling. It showed the occupied room exactly as Kevin remembered seeing it. The lamp glowed beside the bed. The medical equipment stood in place. The man remained motionless beside the window. However, when Kevin zoomed in on the image, he noticed something he had not seen before. The man was not looking at the camera. He was looking at the bed, and lying beneath the blankets was someone else. Someone whose face looked exactly like Kevin. The hospital was demolished later that year. Yet people still discuss the mystery online because of one final detail. According to archived weather reports, a major snowstorm struck the area on the exact night Kevin entered the hospital, the same date listed on the final incomplete evacuation report from 1996. Nearly 30 years apart, same date, same storm, and according to the timestamp on Kevin's camera, the final photograph was taken nearly 20 minutes before he ever reached the room.